Thank you, Sue, and hello everyone. Yes, Bri Williams is my name. I'm the Principal Consultant at People Patterns, and as Sue mentioned, I'm not a market researcher. And in the context of this discussion, the perspective that I'll really like to share with everyone is that I'm a business person. I'm one of your clients, and I really see a significant opportunity for market researchers to understand more about behavioural economics and apply it. Now, Ray has just done a great job in warming us up in terms of a little bit about what behavioural economics is. I guess I would really like to talk about the commercial application as opposed to the research methodology application. So let's kick off. Okay, so sorry for the delay. So businesses, what are they thinking about? Well, when your clients are talking to you about their problems, they can use language like, we've got a decline in our market share, we're looking at new market potential, we've got a brand engagement issue, we're looking to drive greater marketing effectiveness, or we're testing a new product. So businesses talk about business issues in a particular way. What they are really looking for, what they're really trying to resolve, is what will people do? What will people do if we launch a new product? What will people do if we increase our prices? What if we change our marketing methodology? So it's behavioural change that businesses unwittingly sometimes are looking for, because business ultimately is about behavioural change. You're taking people from one state to another. You're taking them from a browser to a buyer. You're taking them from a competitor to you. You're moving them from an occasional buyer to one that's frequent, low spend to high spend, small to large. So really, businesses ultimately are about behavioural change. And of course, businesses turn to research to resolve this uncertainty, to get a few answers about what will happen. Now, this is a very conceptually easy model, and apologies if it's not as sophisticated as yours, but ultimately businesses have an issue, they combine that with research, and they seek to resolve that issue. And this is the traditional research engagement process from a client's perspective. As an example, for instance, client issue, this client had a market share decline of 2.5% over 4 years. Now, to give you a sense of scale, that was in the realms of $200 million. So it was not an insignificant issue for them. They turned to research, and they had a new product concept that they wanted to test amongst their market. Great news. The findings from that $4 million research program was that it would reinvigorate the brand, the product was preferred to their competitor, and that they would gain market share. Now, in amongst this, and they did a lot of not only sampling, product sampling in their methodology, but focus groups, they had this niggle, this 10 to 12% of their research groups that were negative. But despite that, they moved on, they launched the product. Now, this was a famous case study, of course, because it was New Coke. So New Coke, the case studies after case studies have been written about the New Coke model. They proceeded to launch on the basis of everything looking right in the research, but they were blindsided by the behaviour, the reaction in the market to this new product. It wasn't picked up in their research, and in fact their president quoted, "The time, money and skill poured into consumer research on the new formula could not measure or reveal the deep and abiding emotional attachment to the original Coca-Cola felt by so many people." So New Coke, you can look at as an example of research really not capturing what people were going to do. And it's this issue, this frustration that clients have between research outcomes and real outcomes. There's a gap between intended and actual behaviour. We have speculative and contextual response in intended behaviour, and in actual behaviour, of course, we have historical behaviour and rationalised explanations to rely on. Now, in terms of how you might imagine this, I tend to think of it a bit like a canyon. On one side, we've got the might do, the intended behaviour. I will, I would, I think. that sort of stuff that is driven out of focus groups, and indeed that's what Coke was experiencing. On the other side of the chasm, we've got historical behaviour, so observational, ethnographic. They did and I observed. But what your clients are really looking for is what will they do? What's the gap in between? And this, I believe, is where behavioural economics can provide researchers a method to bridge those two areas. You can use this in your existing methodologies to round them out so that you've got not only intended, actual, but you've got predictive behaviour. So what is behavioural economics? Ray, in his previous discussion, covered that, but it's really the study of emotional, cognitive and social influences on economic decision-making behaviour. It's what we do, it's how we are influenced, and it's, most importantly, what we are likely to do. In terms of where it sits, and again this was covered, but there's the economists on one end of the scale who believe that we always deal rationally. So an economist would say we're interested in maximising the return, for instance, on our labour, so we would only work for reward. Well, it's proven, of course, that many of us volunteer our labour, so that argument falls away. On the other side, there's psychological need states and cognitive research. Behavioural economics, depending on who you talk to, can fit somewhere more towards the economic or more towards the psychological. And picking up on what behavioural economics is, and subject to Ray's discussion about the content, the language of it, but the central tenets of behavioural economics: number one, we are irrational. In other words, we do things and we are influenced by things we don't even necessarily consciously process, although if we were asked in a research group, certainly we'd come up with a rational response. What's the clock radio they're doing? Well, that's because in terms of System 1 and System 2 thinking, you might set the alarm for getting up and going for a morning run, and of course when the alarm goes off you hit the snooze pretty quickly, because we are always fighting within ourselves about what we want to do in our planned sense and what we actually do. The picture of yogurt, the marker is small, but it says on there 97% fat-free. We're more likely to purchase a product that is 97% fat-free than we are if the label said 3% fat, even though statistically, of course, it's the same. I don't know if anyone in the audience is still wearing one of these, but power bands became very, very popular for a very short period of time, but we can be influenced by what others are doing and by things that are not rational. And lotteries, well, there was a big one in America recently, but statistically you've got about 1 in 6 billion chance to win, but it doesn't stop us dreaming. So there are influences to how we behave, and we are not always behaving in our best interests. And of course the second component of behavioural economics are patterns to our behaviour. We tend to be a little bit like sheep. If we don't know what to do, we'll tend to follow others. We use rules of thumb all the time, and a bit like Veruca Salt in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, we want it now. We are very, very geared towards the short term. So with that sort of framework in mind, behavioural economics is the study of many, many behavioural principles, and these are just a scattering of them. So the patterns of irrational behaviour are identified through the study of behavioural economics, and these are what the principles that market researchers now have available to you to use in your kit bag to understand human behaviour. Now I tend to boil this down into 4 sections. So there's a whole lot of behavioural principles around congruence, simplification, potency and ownership. Once you develop a framework like this, this is what you can inject into your market research methodology to provide greater client advantage. Let's talk about congruence very quickly. That's very much that we like to make sense of things. So we have a tendency to try and fit things together. We avoid information that doesn't fit into our narrative. We tend to only see information that supports our case. And we also tend to characterize something on the basis of its relationship to something else. So you'll know that as the halo effect. Now for clients, they will be absorbing information that you're providing according to their own personal narrative. And they will tend to seek only confirmatory evidence. So that plays out in the direct client relationship, but also, of course, the consumers themselves. The second dimension of behavioural economics is simplification. We like to simplify our decisions. This is where the System 1 and System 2 thinking that Ray was talking about really kicks in. And by me providing this framework, this is my attempt at simplifying behavioural economics. Essentially, it says that we are on autopilot most of the time, and market research often interrupts that. And so you may get an artificial read on what the actual behavioural outcome will be. So for clients, it's important that the research clarifies rather than confuses their decision, even if it's a complex decision. So your clients will need to simplify, you will need to simplify on behalf of your clients the outcomes for them. Potency. Potency is really about cut through. So when things are vivid, when they're salient, when they're unusual, they're more likely to be remembered. Now, of course, that has a significant implication for research because if things are top of mind, that tends to be where people bring them to the market research table. One of the examples would be, for instance, people will be have a much heightened awareness of insurance needs if they've just experienced flood. This also says that the short term has a greater potency than the long term, so I can comfortably and rationally, or justifiably I should say, buy some shoes today, but I can't get around somehow to managing my superannuation. So there's a tension between the short term and long term payoff. When you're dealing with clients, it means memorable anecdotes will really help bring outcomes to life because they will be vivid, and that's what will be remembered. And the fourth, ownership. Now this is important because we tend to, each of us, own a position from which we make judgments. And we're prone to believing our own behaviour is due to our talent, but success, of course, of others is situational. It's also harder for us to move towards a gain than it is to accept a loss. So that's what Ray was talking about with the ultimatum game. Now for your clients, they may resist your findings if they are counter to their own beliefs. So that's what you'll have to work through. So with a framework like this, behavioural economics becomes a flexible new lens, if you like, that you can use throughout your process. And you'd be using it in order to understand what people are likely to do. Given all of these influences that we're prone to, what are people likely to do in the context of this client question? So let's look at some industry examples of behavioural economics. To the left you've got a light switch, but it's just not any light switch. This is a light switch with a little bit of nudging or behavioural economics applied because it recognises that we tend to forget our immediate actions have a longer term impact. In this case, having the light switched on, we tend to forget that we're spending money. So this is a nice way of cueing behavioural outcomes. In the centre to the top, there's a picture of a letter. This was a trial done in the US by a utilities provider who was trying to reduce people's energy consumption. Knowing that people are very much swayed by social norms, people received their normal utilities bill but with a graph showing how their usage compared to that of their neighbours. Now, this had the great impact of reducing energy consumption amongst those that were binging on energy. The other interesting thing, of course, though, was that people who were doing better than average, in other words, were low energy consumers, they tended to get a little bit lazy because there's such a thing as regression to the mean. So everyone, so the over average consumers and the under average, everyone tended to cluster in the middle. How to resolve this? Well, the utility provider did a very interesting thing. They put a smiley face to positively reinforce those that were using less energy than their neighbours. Now that had the impact of securing that energy consumption. In other words, people who were doing better than average kept doing that. They did not expand on their energy consumption, which was terrific. Now over to the right, Westpac in New Zealand, they struck upon the insight in behavioural economics that we are very impulsive. So we tend to spend on impulse. Don't I know it? We tend to spend on impulse, but their strategy was to increase savings. So they've flipped the model and created an app that people can impulsively save. Imagine yourself in the coffee shop. You think, oh, I'm going to buy a coffee for $3. I really should do more about my savings. You hit a magic button on your phone and you transfer money into your savings account. That really is capitalizing on impulsivity, and it's growing savings accounts in that market. And the final one is US Cellular, who are a regionally based phone provider in the US. They have differentiated their loyalty program, and it's based around behavioural economics. They realise that people really not so interested in network coverage, and they're not really interested in a choice of phones. They're more interested in having their phones upgraded or replacing their phone for free if they tend to break it. So some great examples of how behavioural economics has been applied in the market. So in terms of how this fits, so a behavioural framework can deliver answers about what people are likely to do. So already you'd have methodologies in market research about what they'll say they'll do. You have methodologies about what they have done. Behavioural economics can be the final chapter in that, which is what are they likely to do. So in New Coke's example, for instance, they could have looked at whether the Coke employees themselves were avoiding information that was contradicting their own intended behaviours, because the CEO, for instance, was pretty hot to trot on launching the new product. They would have looked at bandwagon effects. So what is the social norm and what is the behavioural outcome of a product change of this magnitude? Potency, so once people started to feel that classic Coke, as it then became known, was retracted from the shelves, it had a scarcity perception which created a bit of a panic buy. And of course loss aversion. So loss aversion in ownership is, what are you taking away from me? Because Coke did not explain at any point to its market what the benefits of the change were going to be. So I really believe behavioural economics can deliver behavioural answers to your clients around what people will do. Now, of course, it's not going to answer with particular certainty, but it takes us much further along the line of knowing what they are likely to do, and using a simple framework and adding that to your existing methodologies can create greater client advantage for you. Thank you.